It was the summer of 2015, and I was house-sitting for my aunt and uncle while they went on a week-long vacation to Europe. They lived in a sprawling, two-story farmhouse at the edge of a small rural town. The house itself was beautiful but old, creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, and more nooks and crannies than I could keep track of. It was isolated, too, with the nearest neighbor about a half-mile down the road. I was 21 at the time and welcomed the idea of some quiet time alone. My job was simple: feed their 2 cats, water the garden, and make sure the house didn't burn down. Easy enough, or so I thought. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I spent my time reading, watching TV, and scrolling through social media. I had even started to enjoy the quiet solitude. The only sounds at night were the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant hum of cicadas. But by the third night, things began to change. It started with small, almost imperceptible things. I'd leave the living room to grab something from the kitchen and return to find the TV volume turned down, even though I hadn't touched the remote. Or I'd hear what sounded like faint footsteps upstairs when I knew I was alone. I chalked it up to the quirks of an old house, wood creaking as it settled, drafts moving things around. But the unease grew as the week went on. On the 5th night, I was in the living room, binge-watching a show, when I heard it. A soft knock at the front door. The clock read 11:13 p.m. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor, but who would visit at this hour? I hesitated, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. A man's voice, low and calm. "Hello? I need some help. My car broke down. Can you let me in?" Every instinct screamed at me not to answer. I stayed silent, hoping whoever it was would think no one was home and leave. But the knocking persisted, growing more insistent. Then came the voice again, now slightly agitated. "I know someone's in there. I saw the light. Please, just open the door." I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. Peering through the peephole, I could see a man standing on the porch, but the light was too dim to make out his features clearly. He wasn't holding a flashlight, nor did I see a car on the driveway. Something about the situation felt wrong. "I can call a tow truck for you," I shouted through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause. Then, almost too quietly to hear, the man replied, "No need. I just want to come inside." I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher what was happening. She told me to stay on the line and lock all the doors and windows. I did as she said, double-checking every lock in the house while the man continued to knock and call out from the porch. Eventually, the knocking stopped and the man's voice faded into silence. I stayed on the phone until the police arrived about 15 minutes later. When they searched the property, they found no trace of the man. No footprints, no sign of a car, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The officers assured me they'd patrol the area and advised me to call if he returned. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to shake off the lingering fear, convincing myself the man was probably just some unlucky traveler who'd moved on. But as night fell, the unease returned, sharper than before. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. It had come from downstairs. Grabbing a flashlight and the only weapon I could find, a heavy metal candlestick, I crept toward the staircase. As I descended, I could hear something, a faint shuffling sound coming from the kitchen. The sight that greeted me when I reached the bottom of the stairs sent a chill through my body. The back door was wide open, swinging gently in the night breeze. The shuffling sound was coming from the pantry, where the door stood slightly ajar. I was terrified but knew I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I approached the pantry, gripping the candlestick tightly. My hands were slick with sweat as I reached out and yanked the door open. Nothing. The pantry was empty, save for shelves of canned goods and cleaning supplies. I stood there, trying to calm my breathing, when I heard it again. Soft, deliberate footsteps, this time coming from upstairs. I felt a surge of panic. I had just been upstairs. Someone had been in the house with me the entire time. Clutching the candlestick, I crept back up the stairs. The hallway was dark and quiet, but as I moved toward the guest bedroom, I saw it. the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway. I froze, too scared to breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to come closer. Finally, I found my voice. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, it said, "This house, it isn't yours." I screamed and bolted back downstairs, my fear overwhelming any sense of rationality. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 again, locking myself in the bathroom while I waited for the police. I could hear footsteps above me, moving back and forth, as if the intruder was searching for something or someone. When the police arrived, they found the back door still swinging open, but no sign of the intruder. Once again, there were no footprints, no evidence of forced entry. It was as if the person had simply disappeared. The officers stayed with me until sunrise, but even their presence couldn't erase the feeling of dread that hung over me. I spent the final 2 nights of the week sleeping at a friend's house, unable to set foot in that farmhouse again. When my aunt and uncle returned, I told them everything. They were sympathetic, but skeptical. My uncle, ever the pragmatist, suggested it was just my imagination running wild in an old, creaky house. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and to this day, I can't explain it. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about the figure in the guest room doorway. I wonder who or what it was. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, it's still watching, waiting for another house to call its own. I was 18, living in a small town in upstate New York. Our house was an old 2-story colonial, creaky and full of shadows, but it was home. My parents had gone on a weekend trip to celebrate their anniversary, leaving me home alone for the first time in my life. At the time, I thought of it as a rite of passage, a test of my independence. I could handle it, or so I thought. It was late autumn, and the nights had grown long and cold. The house was always eerily quiet at night, save for the occasional groan of the wind against the windows or the creak of old floorboards shifting as the house settled. That first night, everything seemed normal. I cooked a frozen pizza, watched a couple of movies in the living room, and went to bed around midnight. I'd barely drifted off when I woke with a start, unsure of what had stirred me. The silence was heavy, oppressive even. Then I heard it, a faint noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door creaking open. I lay there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then came another sound, soft, deliberate footsteps on the hardwood floor. My heart was racing. The logical side of my brain told me it was probably the wind rattling something loose. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. Someone was in the house. I reached for my phone and froze when I realized I'd left it downstairs on the kitchen counter. My only connection to the outside world was 2 floors away. I sat in my bed, paralyzed, barely breathing as the footsteps stopped. Then I heard another sound. The basement door creaked open. Our basement was old and unfinished, the kind of place where you didn't linger unless you had to. It was dark, damp, and full of forgotten things. Boxes of old clothes, broken furniture, holiday decorations. The thought of anyone going down there made my skin crawl. I waited, straining to hear any movement, but the house was silent once more. Against every instinct in my body, I decided to check it out. Grabbing my softball bat from the corner of the room, I quietly crept out into the hallway. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step feeling like a shout in the oppressive silence. When I reached the first floor, I scanned the living room and kitchen. Nothing was out of place. The back door was locked. Then my eyes landed on the basement door. It was open, just a crack. I hesitated, staring at that dark sliver, my grip tightening on the bat. I told myself it was probably nothing, just the draft pulling the door open. But deep down, I knew better. Slowly, I pushed the door open and flicked on the light. The dim bulb at the bottom of the stairs cast long, menacing shadows across the basement. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. It was a stupid thing to do, but the silence was suffocating. No response. I took a few cautious steps down the stairs, the cold air biting at my skin. The basement was a mess of clutter, but nothing seemed out of place. I walked around, checking behind old furniture and boxes. There was no one there. I exhaled, relief washing over me, and turned to head back upstairs. That's when I saw it. A footprint. Fresh, muddy, and unmistakably human. It was right by the bottom of the stairs, leading deeper into the basement. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, my eyes scanning every shadow. The footprints stopped at the far wall, where we kept a few old storage shelves. And then I saw it. A panel of wood leaning against the wall, slightly ajar. It wasn't there before. It was covering a crawl space, one I didn't even know existed. My hands were trembling as I pushed the panel aside, revealing a dark, narrow opening. The air inside was colder, heavier. Shining my phone's flashlight into the space, I saw a small, makeshift bedding area, a dirty blanket, a couple of empty food wrappers, and a backpack. My stomach dropped. Someone had been living in my house. Before I could process what I was looking at, I heard it, the softest sound, like fabric brushing against wood. I whipped around, shining the flashlight into the shadows, but I didn't see anything. My breathing was ragged, and every instinct was screaming at me to run. But I had to know. Who's there? I demanded, my voice cracking. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice replied, low and gravelly. You shouldn't have come down here. I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Behind me, I heard heavy footsteps thudding up the stairs, gaining on me. I barely made it to the top when the basement door slammed shut behind me. I threw myself against the door, holding it shut as I fumbled for the lock. The person on the other side began pounding, the sound echoing through the house. I screamed at the top of my lungs, praying someone, anyone, would hear me. Then, as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped. I stood there, trembling, for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound of footsteps retreating. But there was nothing. When I finally mustered the courage to look, the basement was empty. The crawl space was undisturbed, the panel back in place. It was as if the intruder had vanished. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in my bedroom, clutching the bat. When my parents returned the next day, they found me pale and shaking, barely able to explain what had happened. They called the police, who searched the basement and the crawl space but found no one. The only evidence was the muddy footprints and the makeshift bed in the crawl space. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a warning. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that whoever was in my basement that night is still out there, waiting for another opportunity to slip back into the shadows of someone else's home. I live in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind with tree-lined streets and houses that look like they were cut from the same blueprint. My parents were out of town for a wedding in another state, leaving me, a 22-year-old college student, home alone for the weekend. Our house is relatively large, with 2 stories and a basement, surrounded by thick woods that stretch far beyond the backyard. While I never considered myself someone who was easily scared, that weekend tested my resolve in ways I'll never forget. It started innocuously enough. It was Friday night, and I was relaxing in the living room, scrolling through my phone while an old sitcom played in the background. The house was eerily quiet, aside from the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. Around midnight, as I was getting ready to head upstairs to bed, I thought I heard something outside, a soft rustling sound, like footsteps moving through the leaves in the backyard. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped just as quickly as it started, convincing myself it was a stray animal or the wind. I locked the back door and turned off the lights, heading upstairs. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to an odd sound, a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as my grogginess faded, the sound became sharper, more deliberate. It was coming from my bedroom window. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned to look. Standing in the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains was a figure. It was tall, and its face was obscured by the glare on the glass, but I could see a hand pressed against the window pane. I couldn't move. For a moment, I felt like I was paralyzed, my body refusing to react. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness. The logical part of me wanted to believe it was a prank, Maybe one of the neighborhood kids messing around. But something about the way the figure moved, slow and deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the figure was probably a trick of the light, combined with my half-asleep mind playing tricks on me. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows crept across the yard, the unease returned. I decided to keep the downstairs lights on, hoping it would deter any would-be trespassers. Around 10 p.m., as I sat in the kitchen scrolling through my phone, I heard it again, the faint rustling from the backyard. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I crept to the window and peered outside. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, near the edge of the woods, I saw movement. A shadowy figure stood just at the tree line, barely illuminated by the light spilling from the kitchen. They were staring at the house. No mask, no attempt to hide. They wanted to be seen. Fear gripped me, but I didn't want to panic. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering into the receiver as I kept an eye on the figure. They told me an officer would be dispatched, but in a small town like ours, I knew it could take a while. As I waited, the figure began to move, slowly walking along the edge of the woods, closer to the house. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of the back door handle jiggling. I shouted through the door, trying to sound brave. "Whoever you are, I'm calling the police. They'll be here any minute." The jiggling stopped, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, low, raspy, and chilling, spoke from the other side of the door. "Let me in. I just want to talk." I didn't respond. My hands were trembling as I pressed myself against the door, trying to keep it from rattling with my heartbeat. The voice came again, this time closer to the window. "I saw you looking at me last night." My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. Whoever this was, they'd been watching me. My pulse quickened as I backed away, grabbing a kitchen knife for what little comfort it could provide. Minutes felt like hours until I finally saw the flashing red and blue lights of the police car approaching. The figure bolted into the woods before the officers arrived. They searched the area but found no one. For the rest of the weekend, I stayed with a friend, unable to bear another night alone in that house. When my parents returned, I told them everything. We installed cameras and motion sensor lights around the property, but I still feel uneasy every time I look out into those woods. I never saw the figure again, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint tapping on the windows, and I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for another chance.